Okay, so we were talking about the deadly weapons, the new weaponry that has an impact in World War One, and there's a lot of other newer weapons that get used during the war, like poison gas and flamethrowers. But the ones we're mentioning are ones that have a devastating effect. And the last thing we mentioned was the machine gun, and we said that that leads to a lot of problems for people because armies are traditionally lining up against each other. Using traditional rifles to shoot at one another, and that had already become dangerous because of the accuracy of rifling and the way that rifles now were able to shoot and the distances they could still shoot at. And so this is what you would end up with early in the war: lots and lots of dead soldiers because they would be crazy enough to charge a machine gun. And eventually, very quickly, militaries understood they needed to change tactics, or this would be a very ugly war. So here's what develops as an adaptation to the machine gun. You get trench warfare. Rather than charge machine gun nests and go on the attack, in many instances, what what militaries would do, what armies would do, is dig trenches into the ground. Uh, they would dig these trenches into the ground, and ultimately that would keep them safe when it comes to actually fighting the enemy. And you see here the background, the planning of the trenches, and they're put in that capacity, or they're dug in that way. They start to plan them out, and you see at the very front of the trenches kind of a sawtooth pattern, a zigzaggy type pattern. And that whole pattern was designed to protect troops from other problems. If enemies did get close enough to lob in a grenade, or if a bomb or an artillery shell were chucked in there, it would limit the explosion to that general area. The walls would lop it off a little bit, so the explosion wouldn't go outward, or the shrapnel wouldn't go outward. You see down here in the bottom right a makeshift trench by the British and the French soldiers that they made. And obviously, it's a really ugly condition. It looks like they're standing in like mud and nastiness. And so the trenches are going to be a real problem, not just in terms of hiding from the enemy, but the trenches themselves become deadly. And here are the problems associated with that. The trenches start to become more elaborate. Now, the Germans were smart enough to engineer trenches for the long haul. Oftentimes, the British and French never put as much effort into it because they always believed they wouldn't be in the trenches that long. So you see here at the front, if you look from left to right, the problems that would face troops. You had the area in between trenches, no man's land, which was nasty, filled with holes from artillery fire, and you got barbed wire there at the approach. If you've ever tried to get through barbed wire, you know it's never as easy as it looks. And as you're trying to make your way through the barbed wire, you have the frontline trench. The frontline trench is obviously where soldiers are, machine guns are placed there. You also have your infantry with rifles, and they're going to be shooting at you as you try to get through the barbed wire. That is absolute madness. You can also look backwards and see in the secondary trench, you get a concrete blockhouse, a pillbox is what they called it. And they put one or two machine guns in a pillbox, and they would fire at you from that particular position. Usually it's an elevated position, and of course the concrete block gives you shielding from enemy fire. Anybody who charged a trench would hate the pillboxes because they thought that's not really an honorable way to fight. To me, I look at it as a pretty smart way to fight. Now, you get the backline trenches, and the reserve trenches. What you would do is oftentimes you'd exchange out. You'd serve several days or maybe even a week or two in the frontline trench, and then the people from the reserve trench would come and relieve you, and you would get to go to the reserve trench and kind of rest for a little bit. You have what they call dugouts. If that sounds familiar, it's kind of like in baseball, the dugout. Dugouts where you could get below the ground. You would dig massive holes in the ground, and that would be to protect you, for the officers to do their planning, and you could generally get some safety from artillery fire. You see in the back, the very back, you also get the long range artillery, which says that's about 10 kilometers behind the front line, and 10 kilometers roughly is about 6 miles, just over 6 miles. Artillery could shoot way further than this, but if you even got close to the trenches, I mean, you were asking for it. The artillery was pretty accurate in where they could place artillery shells, but you had to be careful too not to hit your own troops. People who are in artillery, especially those close up working with cannons and artillery pieces, ultimately they're extremely loud and they're operating nonstop for hours at a time. So it's particularly deadly. You see an airplane flying overhead as well. So going up against a trench was absolute madness. And that's why the death toll in World War I is going to be so ridiculously high. The tactics hadn't really kept up with warfare in terms of they would try things like charging a machine gun nest that wasn't necessarily advisable considering the new weapons. You see this is a cross section of a trench. You would walk across the boards. If you are smart, you put down boards and you have sandbags and barbed wire up to try to protect you. You stand on the fire step, which would give you, for most soldiers, just enough height to fire over that sandbag with minimal exposure to enemy fire. So it becomes kind of a defensive war. Now, there's other problems in the trenches, the living conditions. You see right here in a frontline trench, you're digging a hole out of the side of the earth and finding a place to sleep for the moment. You really have to be on your guard nonstop. If you're on the frontline trenches, there are not really facilities that allow you to bathe or use the bathroom regularly. Not only that, but you had bacterial infection. More people are going to die from bacterial infection and viruses and poor sanitary conditions than from actual bullets or bombs in World War I. So the trenches are deadly in that regard, but that's not the only thing you have in there as well. Body lice are a very common occurrence, and these little critters will make your existence miserable. And if you're hearing this and all of a sudden you start to get itchy, I understand. If that wasn't enough, let's add on trench foot. That's right, kids. Sometimes the nasty, muddy, watery conditions made for a really difficult time for soldiers for many reasons. But if you did not change your socks and your boots regularly, that nasty, dark, wet place that is your feet becomes the perfect breeding ground for fungus, and that fungus can slowly eat off your feet. The trenches are not a place you want to be. Most of the trench warfare takes place on the Western Front, the border of France and Belgium and Germany. You're going to see on the Eastern Front over in the German-Russian border something very different, but trench warfare is extremely ugly and extremely dangerous. And we'll get to those fronts and talk about those in the next video.